So welcome to the Current Directions in Psychological Science Speaker Series presented by Pearson and APS. I'd like to introduce our next and final speaker of the day, Dr. Paul Hinges, Professor and Associate Chair and Director of Graduate Studies for the University of Maryland Psychology Department. He is also an affiliate of the University of Maryland's R.H. Smith School of Business and the Dickson School of Business at Baruch College. Dr. Hinges' research centers on human resource practices, team organizational diversity and organizational climate, leadership, team processes, and cross-cultural issues, and dynamical systems theory. And his talk today will focus on cross-cultural issues in leadership.
My talk's entitled Cross-Cultural Issues in Leadership, and before we begin, let me just tell you a little bit about my field. I study industrial and organizational psychology, and what this field of psychology is focused on is the scientific study of the workplace. I.O. psychologists are found everywhere, from the classroom to the boardrooms. We focus on improving the workplace, improving performance as well as well-being in the workplace. And the way we do this is we apply the rigor and methods of psychology to issues that are of relevance to business. Things like coaching managers to improve their performance, assessment and fair selection, training people to improve their employability, organizational development, work-life balance, all issues that are very important to organizations for their effectiveness and competitiveness, as well as the employees in those organizations for their success in their careers, as well as for their psychological well-being while they're working in those organizations. The topic that I want to talk to you today about is leadership. That's one of the areas of research interest that I have. And before we get into the specific topic, the first thing we'll do is basically define what leadership is. And if you think about it, leadership really is an influence process. And here's a definition that I really like. It's an interpersonal process by which an individual influences the behavior and attitudes of others. So notice in this definition, it really is emphasizing that it's not an individual who's a leader, but rather leadership emerges from the relationship between two or more individuals. And you're talking about influencing processes by which an individual, who we call the leader, somehow directs the behaviors or even just the attitudes of others to make them align to certain goals. Now, if we think about various leaders and the characteristics or attributes of what make those leaders, we can go back into history and think about some famous leaders to come up with some of these attributes. For example, if we think about Julius Caesar, what are some attributes that Julius Caesar had that made him an effective leader? Well, perhaps you'd say that he was decisive, or maybe he was persuasive, or maybe you'd even say he was ruthless. Well, are those the same characteristics that you would say that were characteristic of a leader like Martin Luther King? Was he decisive, persuasive, and ruthless? Or perhaps did he have a different set of characteristics that made him a leader? Indeed, if you start thinking about all the various people that are leaders, and especially all the various people throughout the world who are leaders, it seems like there's so many different attributes that could make somebody a leader, and it really seems to vary as a function of the society that they come from. So what I'm interested in is how societal culture and leadership merge together. What's the relationship between the broader societal culture, that is its values that a society has, and how does that influence the kinds of characteristics that make leaders emerge, the kind of attributes people want from their leaders, and the kinds of characteristics that would make a leader effective. What I'm going to do today is just tell you about two of the studies that we've been doing. The first study that I'm going to tell you about basically focuses on trying to test the connection between societal culture and the type of leaders that we want. The second study will actually be doing a follow-up and saying, well, do leaders who meet followers' expectations, do they succeed? Are the leaders that actually are consistent with what we want, are they successful? So we're going to review two studies really quickly. Let's focus on study one right now. What's the connection between societal culture and the types of leaders that we want? Now, there are many different ways that scientists approach leadership. My particular approach is what's called the social information processing perspective. It's a lot of words, I know, but I'll explain what we mean by that. The primary researcher who pushes studying leadership with this particular perspective is Robert Lord from the University of Akron. Basically, the social information processing perspective says that people carry mental generalizations around with them that scientists call schemas. These mental generalizations are generalizations about objects, about places, events, or people. Like if I were to ask you, what are the characteristics of a salesperson? I'm sure in your head right now you're thinking of several characteristics of salespeople. Maybe pushy, assertive, aggressive. These kinds of characteristics, if you ask yourself, where are they coming from? Why am I able to produce these attributes from just a category? These are the mental generalizations that we call schemas, and we have them for lots of different objects, lots of different categories of people. One such category is the leader. We have schemas for leaders. Take this example, political leader. I guess especially now that we're going to be coming up to an election season, think about what are the characteristics of political leaders. Well, here are a few. See if you had them on your list when you were thinking about political leaders and their attributes. Decisive, did you have that? Verbal, dishonest, egocentric, integrity, diplomatic, achievement-oriented, power-oriented. I could keep listing, but these were the top ones that I had. Basically, we're saying is that people carry around with them a category that they use to assess leadership, and it's cohesive. When someone asks them about leadership, these are the attributes that usually come out. Now, how does this actually work in a leadership process? Well, the theory, the social information processing perspective says that an observer, this person, sees a particular target person behaving. And basically they start wondering, why are they behaving in that way? How can I make sense of this person? So let's say they see the following behaviors and attributes. Verbal, this person is verbal, encouraging, decisive. This person's also status conscious. According to the social information processing perspective, what we do is we compare the behaviors and attributes we see to the schemas that we have in our head, and we look for a match. The schemas that best match the behaviors are the ones that are activated, and it's how we label the person. So in other words, if our leadership schema sufficiently overlaps with the behaviors and attributes of the person, we decide to call this person a leader, and we start acting in a follower role to the person. So according to this perspective, leadership is a result of a matching process between the observer's schema and the target person's behaviors and attributes. Now, the way I just described it, it sounds very conscious, like you're consciously evaluating a person's behavior and comparing it to your expectations. That's a bit of overgeneralization. It can occur at a very conscious and thoughtful manner, but it primarily occurs at a subconscious level. And really what you see is it occurs quickly, and as an observer, you may have gut reactions about the person. And when you have a match, you say, you know what, I just feel like this person is a really good leader. I can't describe it, it just seems right. Now, there's been some research that asks, what is it that affects the various content of these schemas? Because we do see some individual differences. Not everybody agrees exactly what are the attributes of a leader. Some of the research shows that personality affects the content. Turns out, the more extroverted you are, the greater the likelihood that you will want a more charismatic, outgoing leader. So the more likely that your schema will have outgoingness, extroversion in your leadership schema. In addition, your individual history with successful and unsuccessful leaders also affects the content of your leadership schema. If you've seen somebody who tries to be very decisive and that person failed in every single thing that they've done, then in all likelihood you do not have decisive in your leadership schema. Finally, individual values also affect schema content. So that if somebody values achievement and they are more achievement-oriented in themselves, then in all likelihood, if we looked at that person's leadership schema, we would see that that person would want a leader that was very task-focused and had certain vision for what they want the group to achieve, and would also be talking about the eventual goals and how to attain those goals. So those are some of the characteristics which actually cause individuals to differ in terms of their leadership schemas. Now, while individuals do differ, the interesting thing is that once people start talking to each other, we start seeing some agreement in the content of their leadership. There is some overlap. It's not that no one can agree what a leader is. There's just some unique differences, but there is some overlap. We maintain that societal culture can actually help influence this overlap between the kinds of leadership that people want from their leaders. What culture is defined as the meaning system shared by members of a group or a society. It can be reflected in the objective, human-made part of the environment. You know, if you look at how educational systems are developed or the structure of religious institutions, that says something about what's meaningful or what's important to people from a society or from a group. It's also reflected in the subjective value systems and norms shared by group members. Culture indicates how one ought to behave, or maybe perhaps how one should not behave. It indicates whether some goal is worth attaining or not worth attaining. So culture really affects how people interact with each other. in terms of what goals they pursue, as well as how they interact and how they behave. When we start trying to make sense of societies, we can talk about societal culture in general, but it helps us to try to come up with some certain themes or dimensions by which we can differentiate societies from each other. One of the big names in cross-cultural psychology is Hofstadter. In 1980 developed a system of 4 dimensions that he said differentiated societal culture from one another. I have them listed on this slide. One is power distance. Some societies want power to be differentially distributed. They want those in power, they want those to be on the top, to have more influence and have certain rewards that those not in power, they don't have access to those rewards. Another dimension is uncertainty avoidance, the extent to which the group or society values predictability and certainty in life. Societies can be differentiated on the basis of the extent to which they value predictability or unpredictability. Collectivism, the extent to which the group emphasizes collective distribution of resources and collective action. And finally, Hofstadter said that you have another dimension called masculinity, or he sometimes calls it assertiveness, the extent to which the group has assertiveness or a confrontational style with others. Now, these are just some of the dimensions of culture. In my project, we came up with a few more. Some societies are future-oriented. Some groups or societies value planning, investing in the future, or delay of gratification more than others. Performance-oriented. Some groups emphasize performance improvement and excellence more than others. And humane orientation. Some groups or societies emphasize fairness, altruism, caring, generosity more than others. So basically, these are the dimensions that help us think about how societies differ from each other in terms of their values. And these values will influence the types of behaviors and the types of goals that they undertake. So for the first study, we believe that people in groups, like societies, are constantly interacting and they're sharing their ideas about the world. Now we know that culture shapes their behavior and their interactions. So therefore, we hypothesized, we guessed, that the portion of the leadership schema that is shared among a group of people will be a function of the societal culture. All right? So to test that, what we did is we gathered a team of over 170 co-investigators throughout the world, and we gathered data from 62 different countries. Collecting this information from the financial service industry, food processing industry, and telecommunication services, we had people fill out a survey, and then we finally got responses from over 15,000 individuals from these 62 societies. By the end of it, we collected data from over 1,000 organizations and basically wanted to know what are the attributes that they wanted from their leaders. What we found, well, before I tell you what we found, here's a quick sample. Here are the participating countries that were in this study. Okay. Here's what we found. There are meaningful relationships consistent with our hypothesis between the types of leadership content in the schema and societal culture. For example, team-oriented leadership. The more you want team-oriented, the more you have team-oriented attributes in your leadership schema, you see these kind of attributes in collectivistic cultures, in humane-oriented cultures, And you're less likely to see them in cultures that are trying to avoid uncertainty. Participative leadership. They're less likely, those attributes are less likely to appear in societies that are trying to avoid uncertainty, and they're less likely to be in masculine, also known as assertive cultures. Charismatic or value-based leadership, they're more likely to appear in performance-oriented cultures, and they're more likely to appear in future-oriented cultures. So what you see is consistent with our hypothesis. We have empirical evidence now to show that the culture did indeed influence the kinds of behavioral interactions people had, and it affected their conceptualizations of leadership. The shared aspect of leadership was meaningfully driven by the overall society values. Now, I didn't want to leave this study with the impression that everything that we found about the leadership schema is culturally determined. We did find some universal aspects of leadership. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot of them. Here are the universally endorsed leadership attributes. I've underlined the main summary categories. Everybody wanted some charismatic aspect to their leadership. They wanted a dynamic leader, a motivational leader, a decisive leader, and a team builder. Everyone wanted their leaders to be reliable and trustworthy. Everybody also wanted their leaders not only to be charismatic and trustworthy, they also had to be able to do the job. They had to have some managerial competence. But by far, while we did find some universal leadership attributes, the majority of the leadership construct is culturally specific. Study number 2 basically said, this social information processing approach says that leaders who match follower-leader schemas should be more successful. Do we have any evidence about that? So in order to test that, we went to 24 different countries, collected information from over 1,000 CEOs and their top management teams, and basically tried to see if there's evidence that the leaders whose behaviors are consistent with the desired leadership schema from the society, if the greater the match, the more effective the organization and the CEO was. Here's a sample of all the various countries that were in this second study. The data was collected, culture and leadership schema information was collected from study 1, as you see in 1999 and 2002, and the behavior and outcome information was collected in 2005 and 2008. The hypothesis is that the leader whose behavior match the shared leadership schema will outperform those who don't match, and this hypothesis was supported. We found that CEOs whose behavior matched their nation's leader schema had top management teams that were more committed, they gave extra effort, and the teams were considered more effective. The most interesting is that we found that the CEOs whose behavior matched the leader schemas actually had organizations that had better financial performance. They had higher sales, and they had a higher return on investment. So that's fairly substantial support for the social information processing perspective of leadership. To show you some of the results graphically, here's some results from China. We have all the dimensions of leadership down at the bottom here. And then we have a scale that says 1 would be not important, not part of my leadership schema. 7 is This is a very important dimension or attribute of my leadership schema. And these red lines basically show where the leadership schemas are. So for a visionary, for China, it's fairly high in the leadership schema for people in China. Malevolent is very low. Okay? Compare that to the actual behavior of the average CEO that we got in China. And what we're basically saying here, the blue lines are the behaviors, is this matching process, the difference between the red line and the blue line, for each of these dimensions basically reflects the effectiveness of the leader. You want this distance, this discrepancy, to be as small as possible. Now this shows the overall average. There are some managers in China who are directly hitting their behavior, their blue line is matching the schema exactly, the red line. Some managers are really below it and some are above it. But we found that when they match, they get the best behavior. Here's the result from Russia. All these behaviors over here, by the way, this is the desired level of charismatic leadership behavior. And here's the average level that the CEOs are reported to have in Russia. And so you really see that the gap between the average CEO in Russia in terms of charisma from where people want their leaders to be. And finally, here's the results for the United States. And remember, of course, this result is on the average leader. So overall, our research shows that there's evidence supporting the social information processing interpretation of the leadership process. That is, we supported the hypothesis that societal culture influences the content that people have in their leadership schemas. And it's actually, since it's societal culture, it influences what is shared about leaderships and leadership schemas. Our evidence also supports the belief that the greater the match between the schema and leader behavior, the better the effectiveness of the leader. Better team performance, better organizational outcomes. In terms of future directions of our research, we're going to be looking at how to train people in a cross-cultural leadership setting to become better leaders. How do you take this kind of work and now start improving the effectiveness of their leadership, to improve leadership effectiveness throughout the world? Also, everything that I've presented so far is very cognitive and lacks the emotional element of the leadership relationship. We're now also moving towards understanding how emotions and the role of emotions in the leadership-follower relationship and how that's affected throughout the world. Thank you.
Now let's turn to how you bring this current research into your courses. And we'll turn it over to our master teacher, Marcus Dickson, for our interactive Q&A. Dr. Dickson is a professor and associate department chair at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. He has been recognized by the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology with its Distinguished Contributors in Teaching Award, and by Wayne State University with the President's Award for Excellence in Teaching. So one of the questions that was sent in ahead of time, and that question is, where does this and other IO psychology topics fit in with a typical intro psychology course?
Well, that's a great question. In a lot of in a lot of intro textbooks, there is either not a chapter on IO psychology, or it may be Like in some chapters, it's combined into motivation and work, or sometimes it's an appendix, but oftentimes it's the chapter that gets skipped. If there is a chapter that gets skipped, instructors may choose not to cover the I.O. chapter. And so one of the things that's happened is that the Society for I.O. Psychology recognized that, and they developed a series of short PowerPoint modules that can be dropped into the other chapters that exist. Because, so for example, there might be a short PowerPoint module on leadership that could go into the social psychology chapter. There might be a chapter on, or a short PowerPoint presentation on sexual harassment that could drop into a gender chapter. And so the Society for I.O. Psychology has worked with several publishers to make those PowerPoints available as part of the ancillaries that go along with intro textbooks. So that's one thing that talks about I.O. in general. It can be treated as its own chapter, but really the one way to think about it is that I.O. is drawing from the other disciplines of psychology and applying them into the workplace. So the different topics within I.O. can fit into a lot of different chapters. Just in thinking about Paul's presentation, you could put the leadership as an influence process into a social psychology chapter. You could put the information on culture. Several textbooks include the Hofstadter issues on culture in the personality chapter, referring to it as the personality of the culture. The things about schemas and information processing could fit into the cognitive psychology chapter, or the thinking and learning chapters. And the developing design of doing multiple studies where one leads to the next and tries to rule out differing possible explanations. That whole issue of how the studies were designed would fit into the chapter on research methods, usually chapter 1. So I think the way to think about I.O. is frequently that it fits into a lot of the other chapters, because I.O. is a field that draws on the other aspects of psychology.
Great, thanks. So now we have a question that just came in from an instructor, and the question is, could you give some examples of activities that would be appropriate for students who have no work experience and students who do have work experience? So when you have these two groups in the same class, what are some activities that would be appropriate for both groups?
Yeah, I think that there's actually a lot of things you can do. It depends on what aspect of I.O. psychology you're trying to address. The very nature of the name of the field, I.O., industrial and organizational, leads to some different things. The industrial side of the field is more things like personnel selection and hiring people and choosing the right person and getting the right person in the right slot and then evaluating their performance. And the organizational side is more things like leadership and motivation and organizational culture. If you're focusing on that first part, that idea of personnel selection, there's a lot of exercises you can do around the idea of how would you choose from among a number of applicants a successful person for whatever. You might say, if you were choosing a student for this university, if you were choosing a wide receiver for a football team, if you were choosing a governor, you can identify a variety of situations or positions that people with or without work experience would be familiar with, and work through the process of saying, what are the skills necessary to succeed in this position? How would we find a person who had the skills to succeed in that position? So you can do the personnel selection piece on any number of positions, and then go a step further and say, once we've chosen this student, wide receiver, governor, how will we evaluate whether they're doing a good job? And you move into the performance appraisal system and towards measurable behavioral outcomes. So from the selection side, that's a fairly easy thing to do, because there's a lot of positions where we select people that are not inherently work positions. on the organizational side, Paul was talking a lot about leadership and motivation and influence processes, and we are all familiar with people who have an influence on us. And one exercise that I've done before is to ask people to think about the person who has influenced them the most, and then ask about what was it that that person did that led to them being influenced by that person. Was it specific behaviors? Was it personality? Was it values? Was it adherence to values? But think about how that person was influential over you, and then how you might influence others by relying on that same sort of influence process. So the principles in I.O. are certainly applicable beyond just being in a specific workplace situation. So I think it's not an unsurmountable challenge to mix a working and a non-working group of students.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. We've got actually a couple questions that are very similar, so I'm going to try and combine them.
Okay.
And the question is, they're student questions, and it is, I often feel that I don't know what careers I can enter with an I.O. degree. How would you address these issues with students taking an I.O. course?
Well, as with a lot of the other disciplines in psychology, an I.O. degree is not going to be an undergraduate degree. And the typical undergraduate major in psychology is a generalized major. So an I.O. degree would be some level of graduate degree. So I have two aspects to the answer. The first thing is that in a lot of fields of psychology, especially the research-related and some of the mental health-related fields, a PhD is sort of the entry degree to be doing some of that work. But in I.O. psychology, a master's degree in I.O. psychology is often a very strong entry-level degree, both for consulting and for working in organizations in human resources. So there are a lot of very strong terminal master's level programs. So that would be the first answer, that we're looking at a variety of levels of training, whether it's a master's or a PhD, for whatever career you choose to follow. The second answer would be to go to the website for the Society for I.O. Psychology, SIOP.org. You can also find it by going to Division 14 of APA, the APA website, and APS can also get you there through their website to information on industrial organizational psychology. And so on that website, there's a whole range of materials about careers in I.O. The common careers are going to be either working in an organization doing things related to human resources. So you might be working for I'm in Detroit, so maybe working for an auto manufacturer like General Motors or Ford, doing large-scale human resources work, or consulting as a possibility, where you would work with a variety of organizations to resolve problems that they might be facing, and you'd typically have some kind of a specialization there. And then finally, well, government as well. There are a lot of governments, especially at the local and county levels, that employ I.O. psychologists to help them in their hiring, just as they would in an organizational setting. And then academics, which are more research-focused typically, but also frequently engage in consulting. Those are your dominant opportunities within an I.O. career, but the SIOP webpage can really give you a lot of details on that.
Okay, great, thanks. And so we have one more question I believe that we have time for.
Okay.
This is from an instructor, and the question is, how do we explain cultural differences in a way that is descriptive and not evaluative? So how do you evaluate without judging?
That is such a great question, and it can be a real challenge. And the thing that I have found is two techniques that I use, and I don't know if they're quite techniques, but two preparatory things that I'll do before we lead into that conversation. One is to ask whether we think that cultural differences exist. Is it the case that cultures differ from each other? And most people will agree that yes, there are cultural differences. And then I say, okay, give me an example of a cultural difference. And at that point, people often become very uncomfortable. People are very comfortable saying there are cultural differences and we need to respect them, but less comfortable in saying, here is an example of a cultural difference. And so once we've opened the door to the conversation and agree that there are cultural differences, then we can enter into it and say, well, one way to think about it is simply by looking at the data. And so in the things that Paul described, using the dimensions developed by Hofstadter and by the Globe Project, for example, you can say that the average response to certain questions in a given society differs from the average response given in a different society. That allows you to emphasize some key intro-psych concepts, like the fact that the mean doesn't represent everyone. You can say that even though the mean in a culture is higher than in another culture, there's still a tremendous amount of variety within that culture. It's just the central tendency response. And then the other piece of that is to just be very upfront and say, we may be feeling some discomfort. Let's all acknowledge that discussing cultural differences can make some people uncomfortable. And we want to be clear that that what we're talking about is exactly what the questioner said. We're describing something, we're not evaluating it. Some of the work by McClelland, where he showed, for example, that the type of children's stories that were prevalent in different cultures, whether those children's stories emphasized relationships or achievement, whether that was associated with the economic development of that society decades later, that raises an interesting question. It says that cultural differences lead to outcomes, but the relational outcomes are valuable. They may not be as directly measurable, but they're as valuable, and that may be what that culture chose to emphasize. So you can point out with data what the differences are, and that allows you to have the conversation without saying, you can say these things are different without being better or worse. But that's a great question, and it always is a delicate dance between cultural difference and stereotype. Absolutely true.
Well, thank you, Marcus, and I want to thank Paul. We've come to the end of our first day of our two-day Current Directions in Psychological Science speaker series. So just on behalf of Pearson and APS, I'd like to thank all of our speakers today for volunteering their time to share their current research and insightful teaching strategies. And I'd also like to thank all of the students and instructors who participated in today's event.